Today we're going to look at the CEB Storytellers Bible. This Bible is 1,762 pages. It has 12 full-color glossy maps in the back. It's single column, black letter edition. So we'll look at some of the features, and as we're getting ready to do that, if you haven't already, love for you to subscribe to the channel if you find these reviews helpful, and let people know about them. Help spread the word about Disciple Dojo and what we do here. All right, let's take a look at this Bible. I had never heard of this Bible. I did not know it existed. I knew about the CEB. I've reviewed, for instance, the CEB Study Bible here on the channel, but I didn't know what the CEB Storytellers Bible is. This was a used copy that a viewer sent, so there's a little bit of water damage here on the pages. I don't know if it shows up too well. Yeah, looks like somebody got real excited during their quiet time devotional with their coffee. Must not have been holding that mug with both hands. You have a list of the contributors. The main editors are Michael Williams and Dennis Smith. Then it lists some of the other contributors. The only name that I recognized was James Howell. He's actually a local United Methodist pastor here in Charlotte, but the rest are names I'm just not familiar with. Then you come to the preface, and they talk about back in the late 80s, there was something published called the Storyteller's Companion to the Bible. Each volume would include the text of a biblical passage along with commentary by a scholar aimed at giving the background, literary, historical, geographical, and cultural, to help tell the story. In addition, each passage would be followed by a sample retelling of that story, or one based on the passage if the text wasn't a narrative. And within the body of the retelling, in shaded boxes, there would be retellings of midrashim, Jewish interpretive stories related to that passage. So the idea was to give people a resource that can help them re-communicate scripture in new and interesting ways. And so that then became the goal of this Bible, is to actually combine that with the text of Scripture, in this case the CEB, and to have it in a one-volume edition. William says, as you read these scriptures, let me encourage you to look at them and listen to them with an eye and an ear for retelling them. My hope is that the work we prepared so long ago will be helpful to you as you enter the worlds of Scripture and find in them stories that last, perhaps even your story. Then there's a section, what are the midrashim, the sidebars? Now throughout, there are these dark boxes, and these have midrash. The midrashim are a collection of Jewish writings, and they're available free online. I'll put a link to Sefaria.org, which is an online Jewish library. You can find all of these midrashim full there, both in Hebrew and in English. But they included them in this study Bible, and they say, in short, we can learn the stories the rabbis told about the scriptures to interpret them for their time. In addition, we can follow the example of the rabbis and learn to tell stories about Bible stories that interpret them for our time. And then there's a follow-up about if you want to read more about the different collections, there's some resources you can do that there. Then they have another article, because there are no midrashim for the New Testament, obviously. What are the New Testament parallel story sidebars? And they say parallel stories are provided here to help us trace some of the background and foreground of the stories about Jesus. They are intended to give us a sense of the cultural cues within a story that would have been noticed by the ancient audience. There's a section about how even the authors of the New Testament made use of, quote, pagan traditions, throughout Acts. Like, for instance, Paul at Mars Hill used a story that was well known to his audience at the Areopagus, the unknown God. He just referenced it and used that as kind of a connecting point to tell the gospel story. Well, if we don't know the background of that, and we don't know that story like the Athenians knew, then we might miss some of the import. So that's what these kind of outside parallel stories or pagan traditions or other, cultural resonances is what I like to say. That's why they're used in this scripture. And then there's a bibliography about New Testament background. Then you come to the preface to the CEB. The CEB, the Common English Bible, it's relatively new. It came out in the 2000s. And it's basically, I like to say the CEB is kind of like the mainline or liberal version of the NLT. So like what the New Living Translation is for most evangelical or conservative Christians, the CEB is for more mainline or liberal Christians. It reads that way. It's a more colloquial, a little more paraphrastic. It's not a bad translation. I mean, there are some things in it I think that are just awful. There's one verse in particular in 1 John that I think is ridiculous. But overall, it's fine. I mean, I would never steer someone away from it. I would just say, like the New Living Translation, understand that it is intentionally meant to be more everyday readable. And if you're going to do precise biblical word studies, then you would need to supplement the CEB with a more, I don't want to say literal, but a more literal-ish translation. So we come to the Old Testament, and there is a narrative introduction to Genesis. And this doesn't get into things about the authorship of Genesis, the different documentary theories, the ancient Near East background. It's basically, they're taking the approach of however we got the final form of the text. It was arranged intentionally, and it contains elements of narrative and storytelling that are very intentional. And so we need to be able to pick up on those if we want to read it as a story. They don't make comments about, is it a true story? Is it an allegory? Is it a myth? Is it ancient ramblings of people trying to make sense of their world? They don't get into that. They're just like, it's a story. Here are the literary characteristics of it. And that's a very helpful thing to note. Sometimes we can get too bogged down in the historicity or trying to, figure out how it concords with science or the biblical theological themes of it. And sometimes we do miss the fact that Genesis is just a really well-crafted narrative story. So this does a good overview of introducing it. The plot, the characters, the characterization, the point of view. And then we come to the Bible itself. And this is how it's arranged. At the beginning of each narrative section of Scripture, and that's really important, it's for the narrative, there is a brief, like a note about what that section is. So this is Genesis 1:1 through 2:4. That's what's classically considered Genesis 1. And it gives a quick overview. And then it gives in blue, this is in blue font. I don't know if it's showing up on the camera very well with my lighting, but this is blue. The text that's in blue is an introduction to the story, and it's extensive. This is about a page and a half. And it talks about things, like the repetition of certain phrases, let there be, the days corresponding to one another, and then the switch to let us make when it's time for humanity to come on the scene, and how that's a testimony to the uniqueness of human beings in creation. And so they say a storyteller can use the same technique of repetition and alteration in retelling. And then you have the text itself right here. So this is Genesis 1 in the CEB. And then you have one of these midrashim. So this midrash comes from Genesis Rabbah, and it's not even quoting the midrash. It summarizes an aspect of Genesis Rabbah 1:1. So it says, with whom did God consult when beginning to create the universe and all that's in it? Some rabbis said that, like a builder consulting an architect's drawings before beginning construction on a building, God consulted the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, before speaking the universe into being. Apparently, this record of the relationship between God and human beings was much more than a book. The rabbis saw it as a living, breathing design for living that had assisted God in creation. This is similar to the role described for wisdom in Proverbs 8:22 through 31. Could this be the we that God refers to later when humans are about to be created? And then it gives the Genesis Rabbah 1:1. So you can go and actually read Genesis Rabbah, and you can read this discussion, how the rabbis did discuss, and the ones who did suggest that it was Torah that God was talking to. And of course, that's not the only rabbinic view. There's no such thing as the rabbinic view on pretty much anything. Rabbis throughout the centuries engaged in conversations, in debates, and a lot of that is what the rabbinic writings are. They record those debates, they preserve those discussions, and that itself is very formative for different traditions within Judaism. So you're not getting study notes on any of the pages. You're getting narrative introductions that kind of say this is how the story is proceeding and this is what to look for. Then you get the text, and then you have midrashim throughout. So next section of Genesis 2:4 through 25. This is known as the second account of creation, Adam and Eve in the garden. There is, again, an introductory, and I think this is a printing error because most of the midrashim boxes, they're this dark on the page, and the font and the text is all this dark. But there's a number of pages in here that it's just printed really light. It's not different. This should be printed darker. So I think that this is like, I just got a bad error copy. But regardless, it does the same thing. It goes on and talks about what's happening in the story next. And they say, if you're going to retell this and you want to preserve, like, Adam is both the man and the woman at first. Only later, when the woman is taken out, does Adam move into what we would call a proper name, Adam and Eve. And so Adam is related to the word Adamah, dust of the earth. And so they say, if you're retelling this, you might call this figure Dusty. They're just like, it's a generic name. Dusty can be a boy's name or a girl's name. Dust comes from the dust of the earth. And so they talk about Dusty instead of Adam. So again, it's just the goal is getting you to think about and maybe retell these stories in a different way. It's kind of like what Eugene Peterson wanted the Message to be. He never wanted it to be a Bible translation. He wanted it to be a way to get people who are so familiar with Scripture to kind of see it through new eyes. So he would intentionally word it in unique and creative ways. Unfortunately, people started to use the Message as a Bible translation, and that's unfortunate because that's not what it was for. But that's kind of along the lines of what this Bible is getting people to do. So, there's some more Midrashim here. Then Genesis 3 and the fall, there's a narrative overview of that. It's about a page and a half. More Midrashim. Then Genesis 4, there's another narrative overview of that. Excerpts from Genesis Rabbah. So that's what this study Bible is. There are no study notes, and the only introductions come in the narrative sections. Now, this version does not contain the Apocrypha. I don't know if the CEB published one with the Apocrypha or not. I know the CEB has translated the Apocrypha, but it's not included in this one. And, there are whole books that don't really have any Midrashim or narrative notes at all. Like there's a couple for Amos, but then Obadiah, there's nothing. Jonah is a narrative. So there's a narrative section. There's a couple of Midrashim. There's a couple in Micah, but we come to Nahum and there's nothing. So then we come to the New Testament and there's an introduction, a narrative introduction to the synoptic stories about Jesus. That'd be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's about 4 pages. Then there's an essay on reading the parables, and that parables were actually found in the Hebrew Bible as well. They call it the First Testament. They were found in apocalyptic literature. They were found in rabbinic literature. So then there's a section on hearing parables today, and then troubling aspects of the parables. And then we get into Matthew, and it's the same format. Introduction to a section, quick overview, narrative introduction that's extensive, in this case, over 2 pages. And then the parallel text here in the box, in this case, this note summarizes a writing of Plutarch and Life of Alexander, an ancient biography and how those were composed and what that tells us about New Testament biographies like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Some of the other parallel texts, like this one is from Josephus, Antiquity of the Jews. This is from Suetonius, Life of the Caesars. But they aren't study notes about the text itself. You're not getting exegetical notes. You're getting comparisons and ways that will help you kind of see the story as it would have been heard originally. Then you have a narrative introduction to John, then the book of John itself, same format. Narrative introduction to Acts, then the book of Acts. And then after Acts, there is not a narrative introduction to Paul's letters. In fact, there's no narrative overview at all of Paul's letters. It is literally just, in this case, Romans. This is the text of Romans. That is all. There's no notes. There's no parallel text, Midrashim, nothing. Just the entire book of Romans on the page. Same thing with Corinthians. And I'm going to be honest, this is weird because there's narrative elements to a lot of Paul's writings. Like this Romans has a huge narrative section. The whole, especially like chapters 5 through 8, chapters 9 through 11, and the olive tree. And there's stuff that you can retell what Paul's trying to say in Romans in a narrative way. So I was surprised that there was nothing. And also there are so many parallel passages in Paul, in all of his letters, not just Romans, but all of Paul's letters. There's so many parallel passages from the ancient world. I'm reading a book right now by our friend Joey Dodson about Paul in his ancient philosophical setting. And there's just resonances everywhere. So it's weird to me that they put no notes and no midrashim in any of Paul's letters at all. None. There's nothing in 1 Timothy about, say, Artemis and why Artemis of the Ephesians was very significant for what Paul is saying. Philemon, there's nothing about the story of Onesimus and reconciliation. So I don't know if this is accurate or not, but this is how this feels to me. It feels like Paul got snubbed, and that, and I know in some circles, Paul is not looked upon favorably in some particularly mainline and more liberal circles because of what they see as the overemphasis on Paul in some reformed and conservative circles. This almost feels like an overcorrection. Now that, again, I have nothing to base that on objectively. This is just my impressions as a reader. But let me walk that back just a little bit. They do also snub James. There's no notes on James at all. Peter, and the letters of John. So it's probably not an anti-Paul bias as much as it's an anti-epistles or just the epistles aren't seen as having narrative value. So there's nothing on them. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of narrative value in the epistles. But then you do finally come to a narrative introduction to Revelation. It's about 3.5 pages. It presents the different views, the different way people read Revelation, and this felt like it takes more of the idealist perspective or possibly the eclectic perspective. But then you have Intro to Revelation, a sidebar here from Eusebius and church history, a sidebar from Jubilees and First Enoch. But that's it. There's nothing in the main body of Revelation. And the next narrative section doesn't come until the end, right before the new heavens and the new earth. Then there's charts and indexes in the back. There's a list of the judges of Israel, the kings of Israel and Judah, the family tree of David, the historical setting of all of the prophetic books. Then there are lists of the apostles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, John, and in Paul. Then there's a list of all the parables in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Miracle stories in the Gospels. Then there's the chronology of Jesus's final days, what we call the Passion narrative. There is a list of the different Herods and Agrippas. So sometimes those get confused, especially in storytelling. The partial family tree of Herod the Great. And then there's an overview of Paul's ministry and writings. So kind of like following the life of Paul all the way up to his death. Then after that, there's the story index. So these are all of the narrative sections in the books of the Bible. So you can see there's a lot in Genesis. There's some in Exodus, a little bit in Numbers. There's 3 in Deuteronomy, none in Leviticus, a few in Joshua, Judges, 1 in Ruth. And again, these are summaries of what you find in those sections of Scripture. There's a lot in Isaiah, and then the New Testament. Obviously, there's a lot in the Gospels and Acts and Revelation, but nothing between Acts and Revelation. Then last, you come to an index to the maps. And these are the maps. These are the National Geographic maps. And there are 16 of them. And that's it. So let's do pros and cons first. Pros, I do like that they are trying to get people to see Scripture as narrative, and particularly the big picture narrative, the meta narrative of Scripture, I think is absolutely crucial. We've talked about that here on the channel a lot in our different teaching videos. And when we teach through the books of Torah, you can check those playlists out here on the channel. It's important to see the narrative flow and to see the story as it's being built, as it's unfolding through the pages of Scripture. I think that's a great thing to highlight, especially for people whose only exposure to the Bible is proof texting or memory verses, like a verse for the day, or preachers that just kind of string together different passages unrelated to make a theological point. I think this is good in kind of helping give another perspective than that. I don't mind that it's the CEB. Like I said, I don't love the CEB, but I don't hate the CEB. I think it's okay. I talked about there's a verse in the CEB that I absolutely can't stand. It makes me cringe, and I just think it's the dumbest translation choice. It's right here in 1 John chapter 3. And there's a section in here that talks about God's seed remaining, abiding in people. And of course, the seed promise is one of those big picture meta-narrative themes that run throughout Scripture. Very important concept, the seed promise and the seed abiding, remaining in, and unity with Jesus and the body and being part of the elect, the seed of Abraham. Like there's just a ton of that very, very rich passage. And they translate it as, those born from God don't practice sin because God's DNA remains in them. They can't sin because they are born from God. God's DNA. And the footnote at the bottom, it says, or genetic character. There was no concept of DNA in the first century or genetic character. It's a completely anachronistic and just weirdly, cringily specific. God's, what is DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid. Ugh, it's just gross and weird and dumb. I hate this translation on this verse. It's almost comical how much that translation of that verse bugs me, because it's a very obscure verse. Usually people look at like the big verse. How do they translate the virgin birth? How do they translate son of man? How do they? And I'm just like, I don't know, but they just said God's DNA remains in you, and that's just dumb. So that's always biased me against the C. Like if the CEB did a revision and just changed this verse, I would probably recommend it way more than I normally do. It wouldn't be as cringy as I think it is, and it's only because of this verse. So I'm admitting my bias. I'm admitting that my loathing of that verse colors how I see the rest of the CEB. Now, that was a passage in the CEB that I absolutely hate. Let me be fair. Let me show a passage where I think they absolutely crush it. I think they're right on. And that's the famous Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. The verb iskuo, contextually, it's not talking about doing all things. It's talking about enduring. It's talking about going through, experiencing. So it's not a Christian Superman verse like it's usually used. And we have a section about that in Bible for the Rest of Us. We have a superhero seminary episode here where Professor Superman behind me talks about this verse. And CEB does a great job with this passage. It says, I know the experience of being in need and of having more than enough. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every circumstance, whether full or hungry, whether having plenty or being poor. I can endure all these things through the power of the one who gives me strength. That's a great translation of the Greek of Philippians 4:13. This verse is translated as good as the verse in 1 John is bad. So anyway, for me, CEB, it's a mixed bag. I just want to address that. I've never done a deep dive on the translation itself because that's not really what we do here on the channel. But the other pro, so I got sidetracked. The other pro, I love that this is single column. Single column is the best way to preserve the literary aspect of the text, to be able to see it in chunks and what goes with what and what is poetry. It's no secret. If you watch my reviews, I think all Bibles should be single column. And when it comes to the text of Scripture itself, it's laid out really clean. I don't love how big the subject headings are because these are subjective. These are added by editors, not part of the text. But other than the font size, I mean, the text is kind of small. It's sort of a block of text here, especially in certain sections where there isn't any poetry or a lot of paragraphing. But you get to see Scripture at a big picture level and you get to read Scripture. And so that would be the biggest strength of the CEB Storytellers Bible, is it provides you ample opportunity to just read the text, not getting bogged down in charts and diagrams and running exegetical commentary. Now, those things are all great. And those things are what you should have in a good study Bible. That's why I say this is not a study Bible. So I would not recommend this as a primary Bible, certainly. I wouldn't recommend this as your go-to study Bible. I wouldn't even recommend theologically the way it presents some of the stuff. I just wouldn't recommend this for study. I would recommend it to be used exactly how it says to be used, as trying to absorb the story, think about the story, and then communicate the story in a new or an interesting way that defamiliarizes it so people can hear it again. That'd be the use I would see for this. So, if you're a ministry leader, a Sunday school, youth group, something like that, this might be worth having on the shelf. It might be worth using this as you're preparing a sermon. If anything, it might provide like a jumping off point for retelling Scripture. And so that would be the strength of this. But no, as a study Bible, I wouldn't recommend it. It's kind of a novelty. If you don't have a CEB translation and you want that, this would be fine. Of course, it doesn't have the Apocrypha. That's another weakness. It would be nice if it included the Apocrypha, because the Apocrypha is such a part of Israel's story. The stuff that happened during the Maccabees, for instance, it would be nice that if they had included that. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the CEB Storytellers Bible. Thank you to the viewer who sent it to me. I don't know if this is your coffee stain or not, but I appreciate you letting me take a look at it, and you asked for my thoughts, so there they are. I'd love to hear yours in the comments below. Let me know what you think. If you've used the CEB Storytellers Bible or your thoughts on the CEB in general, happy to hear those in the comment section. Feel free to share here in the dojo. That's what we do. We encourage discussion, sparring, but respectfully done. This is a dojo, not a fighting arena. And that'll do it for now, though. If you appreciate this review, we would love for you to subscribe. And when you do, just tap that little button that enables notifications. Super helpful on our end. And stay tuned for more here at Disciple Dojo. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, as always, keep training.